On 7th October 1960, Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa delivered Nigeria's first speech as a 99th member state of the United Nations. He centered African solidarity in his country's foreign policy, and he established a non-aligned posture for Nigeria's interventions outside Africa. Balewa affirmed this posture in his 1961 address to the joint houses of the U.S. Congress. Nigeria has mostly lived up to that vision, especially in the Murtala Mohammed Obasanjo years. This was her era of clear-sighted, principled, and action-based foreign policy. A couple of examples here. Within a month of her independence, Nigeria deployed peacekeepers to Congo for a 4-year duty tour. Since then, she has sent over 200,000 peacekeeping forces to 30 countries on over 40 missions across the UN, the AU, and ECOWAS. Nigeria is also the foremost state campaigner against apartheid and gave so much diplomatic, military, and financial support to the anti-apartheid struggle in Southern Africa that she became an honorary frontline state, despite the close to 5,000 kilometers between Nigeria and Southern Africa. The country also rejected diplomatic relations with South Africa until 1994, when Nelson Mandela's ANC won the first democratic election. Well, the embassy was opened a little before that. Since then, Nigeria has had continuous ambassadorial representation in Joburg, that is until 2nd September 2023. On that date, Tinubu recalled Nigeria's High Commissioner to South Africa. Over 30 months later, there is still no accredited ambassador on seat. Nigeria had gone from frontline state to silent state. And this diplomatic silence was not South African alone, it was worldwide. The Tinubu Recall of 2023 was the largest single recall of ambassadors announced in one day in world diplomatic history. 83 ambassadors were sacked, leaving all of Nigeria's 109 diplomatic missions abroad, apart from the UN, without substantive ambassadors. It was incredible. Now, 10 of the 68 recent ambassador designates have secured agreements, that is true, but over 30 months later, only 3 substantive ambassadors are in place, if I'm correct. The UN, the UK, and France, Tinubu's favorite foreign country. Unfortunately, with only 14 months left of his tenure, the chances of all the other 106 embassies are not looking good. It is difficult to quantify the paralysis and the negative impact of his self-inflicted decapitation of Nigeria's diplomacy. In principle, there is nothing wrong with a cost-cutting presidency, recalling ambassadors to refocus on domestic priorities. Tanzania's J.P. Magufuli was one such president. He once recalled 3 ambassadors at one time, but he paired his international low-profile policy with a stay-at-home policy, which affected the entire cabinet. He visited only 8 countries, all of them in Africa, and spent about 2 weeks abroad throughout his more than 5 years in office. On the other hand, Punch newspapers estimates that Tinubu has already spent over 245 days abroad, which is more than 20% of his time, or 8 months, in less than 3 years of office. And this is a lot of presidential time, especially in the light of the last Plateau State massacre, when he did not have enough time to leave the just support to the victims in their villages.
This is my brother, this is my son, this is my brother, and this is my wife. A corpse of 8 people. My beloved father, my beloved wife, brothers, and my son.
Much of Tinubu's time abroad, about 90 days so far, has been spent on visits to France, mostly private visits. But on the official side, he did attend an Élysée Palace party with Gilbert Chagoury, who was convicted some time ago for laundering money for Sani Abacha. And this is a season of grave African and international crisis. Since 2023, Africa has been torn by wars in Congo and Sudan, which have displaced over 18 million people. The impotence and the silence of previously dynamic countries like Nigeria has increased the proxy wars for resources by external non-state and state actors on the continent. The result are dozens of insurgencies across the Sahel, across Mozambique, Somalia, Ethiopia, with tens of thousands of people dead, hundreds of thousands of people wounded. And national security and international diplomacy are clearly of little interest to the current managers of Nigeria. Nigeria's wholesale abandonment of our foreign missions has all the hallmarks of corporate raiders who acquire a company in a hostile takeover, replace the board of directors, set new directions for the company, and then break up and strip the company of assets to unlock value. Now, in this metaphor, Nigeria's security sector and international diplomacy represents the assets of a company that are raided for their cash value. Section 14(2)(b) of the Nigerian Constitution states that the security and the welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. Yet over 10,000 Nigerians have been killed by bandits and terrorists since May 2023. Nigeria has historically intervened in civil conflicts and wars abroad, from Liberia to Sierra Leone, from Guinea-Bissau to Gambia. Nigerian mediators and peacekeepers have championed Africa with all their problems. Unfortunately, in recent times, Nigeria has been exporting more crisis than peace. She is the incubator and exporter of the Boko Haram insurgency into the Sahel, with breakaway factions taking up ISIS and Al-Qaeda franchises. Nigeria has also popularized a new stripe of criminality, the abduction of entire schools and villages for ransom. And in 2023, under Tinubu's heavy-handed chairmanship, ECOWAS lost more than half of our territorial area to the Alliance of Sahel States. This was a Pan-African and diplomatic disaster and a major setback to a successful regional body established under the chairmanship of Yakubu Gowon back in 1975. In 2024, 52 countries petitioned the International Court of Justice to declare Israel an apartheid state. This is more than a quarter of all the countries in the world. Sadly, Nigeria was not in that number. This absence, considering Nigeria's antecedents in the anti-apartheid struggle, is mind-boggling. Because a firm consensus is already existing in the humanitarian world, think Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that Israel is an apartheid state. But Nigeria is clearly no longer the scourge of apartheid. It is no longer that vocal mover of motions for the sanctioning of 70s and 80s and 90s apartheid in the United Nations. It is now a silent state. In December 2023, South Africa filed a lawsuit at the ICJ against Israel based on allegations of violations of the Genocide Convention in Gaza. It was a redeeming action that leveraged South Africa's history as a post-apartheid country. In the wake of a genocide perpetrated against an abandoned Palestinian people by the collective US-Israeli military might, in the teeth of the moral and military complicity of the West and the horrified silence of the rest, South Africa rose and gave a moral legal leadership to the world. That lawsuit has been joined now by 19 countries, which have filed interventions under Article 63 of the Genocide Convention. Nigeria, in a stunning display of moral turpitude and diplomatic bankruptcy, was silent. Israel, a fellow settler colonial project to apartheid South Africa, demolished Gaza Bantustan in a hunt for Hamas. It was the most definitive failure of diplomacy this century. 80,000 tons of bombs dropped on 324 square kilometers of one of the most densely populated places on Earth, killing 75,000 men, women, and children, mutilating another 110,000 others in a reality horror show that was streamed for a voyeuristic world. The UN Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory found the President, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the entire state of Israel guilty of the crime of genocide. Where was Nigeria's response? It was silence. In 1961, in reaction to the murder of 69 protesters in Sharpeville, Nigeria banned all trade with apartheid South Africa. We then sponsored and led the expulsion of South Africa from the Commonwealth. We drove high eviction from multilateral organizations across the world. When the West continued to support apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia, we nationalized the assets of British Petroleum. We banned South African Airlines as well as all export of Nigerian petroleum to South Africa. We followed that up with serious investigations to make sure that the oil was not smuggled. All trade, all sport, all academic and cultural links and exchanges with Johannesburg banned. Nigeria led the call for sanctions, mandatory sanctions at the United Nations General Assembly. We granted asylum and scholarships to ANC exiles like Chris Hani, Thabo Mbeki, Oliver Tambo. We funded liberation movements across Southern Africa. In 1977, in reaction to the 76 Soweto massacre that killed hundreds of school children, Nigerian civil servants and students contributed into the South African Relief Fund that raised $10 million in 6 months. Nigeria then campaigned for the first UN mandatory arms embargo against apartheid South Africa. The Nigeria of 2026 is a tragic counterpoint to Nigeria's historic legacy of consensus diplomacy. Instead of sanctioning apartheid Israel today, 2026 Nigeria oils the Gaza genocide and the apartheid state of Israel by supplying about 9% of our crude oil needs. 60s Nigeria leveraged the outrage of the Sharpeville massacre to drive trade embargoes. 70s Nigeria leveraged the outrage of the Soweto massacre to fight for arms embargoes. But 2026 Nigeria, our response to the 2025 El Fasher genocide by the RSF rebels in Sudan is a diplomatic silence and new trade deals with UAE, which is the main sponsor of the RSF. Now, some would argue that Nigeria's domestic poverty makes our impotence on the international stage inevitable. They point to the 450 foreign staff of Nigeria's embassies abroad, which are owed some 6 months in salaries. After all, if you cannot supply electric power to your own citizens, how can you project any kind of power abroad? There is that, yes. But the foreign policy of a rogue republic is a domestic policy of her neighbors. Apartheid South Africa supported UNITA, Renamo, and 8 other rebel groups across her neighbors like Angola, Mozambique. All this resulted in the death of millions of Africans in Southern Africa. Today, many foreign corporations and states, rogue states, are behind the bloody resource wars on the African continent, including Nigeria. So engagement in foreign affairs and an investment in the economic and political health of our African neighbors is not an elective option. It is an existential imperative. It's in the objective self-interest of all countries of goodwill to be fully invested in the collective and neighborly peace and in a rules-based international order that is founded in justice. Now, during his campaign for the vice presidency, Kashim Shettima promised to handle Nigeria's insecurity problems personally. He had clearly not discussed with his principal, Tinubu, who hired Bello Matawalle as Minister of State for Defense. Now, Matawalle was a former Zamfara state governor who was under an EFCC investigation for embezzling 70 billion naira allegedly during his gubernatorial years. Yet Matawalle is real arbitrage as defense minister was not the corruption investigation. It was the allegation of whistleblowers like Musa Mohammed Kamara, his former SSA, that as governor he was patron saint to terrorists, the same terrorists that the defense ministry was now fighting. The allegation was that he had supplied them with trucks, houses, cows, and cars. But Bello had sacrificed his presidential ambitions during the APC primaries to support Tinubu. And Tinubu has a good memory. He was also very bold. From day one, for instance, despite public outcry, he took on the petrol subsidy monster, which had sucker punched his predecessors in office. A similar ruthlessness had combined to blow up tax revenues, which, along with some $28 billion in signed and prospective loans, has enabled the award of trillion naira no-tender coastal highway contracts to High-Tech, which is a Gilbert Chaguri company. Now, at 15 trillion naira total contract value, this 700-kilometer road will be the biggest contract in the entire Nigerian history since creation. This suggests that the all-pervasive silence in the domestic and the international realm is not a bug in the system, but it is our neck on the line, and we should change that system, even if government has chosen the path of diplomatic silence and domestic blindness. We, the citizens, need to open our eyes to find our collective voices and to remind them of Section 14(2)(b) of the Constitution.